Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you here. I have a dream, not the Martin Luther kind. This is a different dream. When I awake on a day not too far from now, I want my eyes to reflect the Africa that dares to thrive only once my eyelids have shut. As if becoming a reality would be far too overwhelming a source of greatness. I want to see the Africa that I have become, to see that same spirit alive in me. And when my last breaths are upon me, I too want to look back and say, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. To be unreasonable is to defy logic. It is to exceed the limits of reason. 5 months ago, a few of us gathered in a room and decided to put together the Oxford Business Forum for Africa. We spoke of things we hoped this day would achieve. We were excited about having all of you here, even before we met you. We knew what we were hoping this day would mean to each individual here with us. But what we couldn't find was a link that tied it all together. What would this common thread be that bound our hopes and dreams for this continent? Against the backdrop of a modern-day dichotomy, where the path to success is often riddled with potholes. This theme, Unreasonable Africa, came to me in the way that some people fall asleep at night, slowly at first, and then all at once. It captured everything about Africa. Her boldness, her defiance, her passion, her integrity. In truth, it is difficult to capture the feelings that Unreasonable Africa invokes through the limitations of vocabulary. Unreasonable Africa is the group of women in a rural village that found a way to generate electricity from mud. It is the global company that launched an e-commerce and delivery service in a country where GPS will only too often tell you to turn left, straight off a cliff. When the global corporate said, we can't do business on a continent where the majority of people are unbanked, Unreasonable Africa turned around and said, who needs banks anyways? But today, Unreasonable Africa is a journey where you are the artist and we want to help you build your masterpiece. It is your platform to enable you to lay the foundations for this engine of growth, empower you with the tools to navigate the political and the global business landscapes, and grant you the resources to scale a business across the continent so that you can soar. Throughout this day, as you wander the hallways, allow your thoughts to be challenged by the speakers that you listen to. I want you to think of one thing. What does Unreasonable Africa mean to you? What does it mean to be unreasonable? Because we can no longer afford to live in a time where you are not. The path of least resistance has long since been shut down. The people have abandoned the road less traveled to carve out a new path altogether. These people, these seemingly irrational, unreasonable people, are you. To echo the words of our wonderful guest speaker at dinner last night, Unreasonable Africa is an idea whose time has come. Speaking of last night, I had the incredible privilege and pleasure of being seated next to our wonderful keynote speaker this morning. If his voice sounds a little raspy at some point, I promise, disclaimer, I had nothing to do with it. I found him like that. I did not talk him to death last night. Trevor Manuel needs no formal introduction. He has been a phenomenal leader in South Africa and still remains a beacon of hope and a beam of pride to many. I asked him last night how he would like me to introduce him, and he dismissed the idea with a casual wave of his hand. I thought he was just being modest, but the truth is, he was probably just being practical. This list literally does not end. I guess what stands out the most is the period when he oversaw one of the most prosperous periods of economic growth in post-apartheid South Africa. Under 4 different presidents, first as the Minister of Trade and Industry, and then as the Minister of Finance. He left on a high note to become the Deputy Chairman of Rothschild South Africa and Senior Advisor to Rothschild Global. He's a serial corporate board member, incredibly passionate about education and the development of our youth. And occasionally, much to my delight last night, an accidental stand-up comedian. Ladies and gentlemen, a heartfelt round of applause, Mr. Trevor Manuel.
Thank you very much, Angwani. You are so kind. Our host, Prof. Peter Tufano, ladies and gentlemen. No, I promised Peter this morning I would not be caught in the LBGT IQ trap. I will say, everybody, welcome, good morning to all of you. I want to express my sincerest appreciation for the invitation to be here. I'm part of subspecies of humans. We are very prevalent in Africa. Our Latin name is Illud Politici. For those of you who still pray in Latin, in the colleges at Oxford, you would know that this is former politicians. There are many of us in Africa, so when we get an invitation, we grab it. Let me just link the Unreasonable Africa to this very place. The name that was given by the Mandela parents to their son, Rolihlahla, is frequently translated as the one who looks for trouble. Now that is being seriously unreasonable, so to have the Unreasonable Africa Conference in the Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela Lecture Theatre, I think, is so opposite. You know, Africa is exceedingly diverse, and part of what we need is to remind ourselves from time to time what holds us together. We have, just in South Africa, we have 11 official languages. Now you multiply this across the continent, you look at languages, cultures, geography, origin. And so from time to time, we need to remind ourselves what holds us together. And in the same spirit as Angwani did, there's a document that was adopted some 3 years ago by the African Union and subsequently by other bodies across the continent called Vision Africa 2063. And in describing the document, it speaks of the rededication to an enduring Pan-African vision of, quote, an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena, unquote. Integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. So the first question I think that we all have to respond to in the context of Unreasonable Africa is, how do we transition from this Africa we see and live in to one that is very different because it will be integrated, prosperous, peaceful, and driven by its own citizens? In fact, it's 53 years in 2 months since the Organization of African Unity was first formed. And the language then was as strong as it is in Vision 2063. But the reality is a very different reality from that which was dreamt at that point and at other important points of Pan-African decision-making. The questions that we have to answer is why we aren't making sufficient progress, what the yoke is that weighs us down and how we lift it, and what measures we need to what measures we need to rely upon as periodic reminders of the progress that we are making towards our objectives. And then when we've answered that questions, we need an answer to what we say to our detractors, of whom there are many. I'd like to start with a little story that transpired from South Africa this week. The Minister of Finance, who was under a very heavy pressure, Pravin Gordhan, assembled a team of business leaders, trade unions, and public servants, and came off to London and then went to Boston and New York to talk to rather difficult people, fund managers, some of whom are present here, ratings agencies, prospective investors. And they went there with a single message, and that message was an endeavor against a sovereign ratings downgrade for South Africa to sub-investment grade. Now, I certainly hope that they succeed in their mission, but I hope that regardless of that, what you have there is the beginning of something that we haven't seen in our country for 23 years. The coming together of government, business, and trade unions and setting their minds on a single set of easily understandable objectives and being confident in taking that message out. And if we can work at that, then I think we can reverse what has been, in fact, our downfall over the past few years, which is talking past each other. Because I think that using the crisis presented by the threat of a downgrade to turn that into hope is in many ways the allegory that's needed for the African continent right now. We need leaders from across all countries and from across every aspect of society to work together to define the narrative and then communicate it. But in defining the narrative, I think it's very important for leaders, whether this be in government, business, or civil society, to understand it's not just a narrative from which they can be separated, because implementation depends very much on their quality of leadership. And for me, it's rather painful to see that we have these grandiose statements of commitment to the future, and in the everyday experience, you look at election campaigns, you look at business conduct, there's no correlation between the two. It might be that there are different drafters, but unless we internalize the commitments that we make into our everyday lives, I think that we'll be sitting in the same position for too long. And I use the term we, not they, because I may be out of government, but I think I still see myself as part of a body of responsible Africans. You see, part of what we need is a narrative that is internalized and trusted and implemented, because it's owned by those who articulate it. For too long, there have been narratives about Africa, frequently from others, whether this be back in the colonial times, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, any of those, or even the Africa Rising narrative. We need a narrative that is ours, that is mindful of the complexity of 54 different states, many different cultures, and can build in a way that continues to create a cohesive march forward. There was a particular point when a group of leaders, in fact, broke out of the paradigm. And this was a group of leaders who came to the fore roughly from the mid-90s, and they were around for about a decade. It's a rather interesting period in Africa's history. They saw the world differently and set store by redefining the continental narrative. In the course of this, they established the African Union, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, the African Peer Review Mechanism. They engaged continually with the rest of the world to create new opportunities for Africa's people. It was out of this effort that, for example, debt relief was provided through the initiative called the Highly Indebted Poor Countries HIPIC initiative. They demonstrated their grasp of what was needed to uplift the continent. And in the course of it, because of the way in which the African peer review mechanism was designed, for instance, the focus was on strong institutions, good governance, a commitment to partnership in order to attract increased flows, and fiscal rebasing through debt relief to allow governments to afford better and more extensive services to their people. They also articulated in the context of partnership the need for trade-offs, because it's a realistic approach to how to deal with the world. And when on top of this, there was this commodity supercycle that came as a fillip rather than the cause of pretty high economic growth over a significant period in Africa's recent past. Two sets of circumstances coalesced to turn the tide. The first of these was the Great Recession that occurred after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. The consequence of which was that many of the countries, especially donors, who'd committed to supporting the African Renaissance before, now turned inwards, committing resources more narrowly to their own electorates, whether to try and bail out errant financial institutions or to support workers rendered unemployed by the recession, and so had to forgo the pledges of global solidarity that had been made in better circumstances. The second set of issues was that the cadre of African leaders who drove this Pan-African bargain were rotated out through elections and or term limits. The new leaders needed to cut their own path, but had to do so in a world that was very different. It was now more filled with suspicion, introspection, and short-termism. In the consequence, the African project and its central economic narrative was somewhat derailed. Now, almost a decade later, it has to be given a new impetus. We have no choice. This is made more difficult because, as I stated, we're not occupying the space to tell our own narrative, and the story of African opportunity is interpreted from the actions of others. By way of an example, last week Barclays PLC announced that it will sell down its shareholding of Barclays Africa. It's a complex matter, and I don't wish to explain or ponder on in this forum. A very widely held view is that the new CEO lost faith in Africa. This prompted a British journalist writing in the Times this week, Matthew Paris, who happens to have been born in South Africa, to write of that decision in this way, and I share it with you. This is the wrong moment to lose faith in Africa. Post-empire, it's the moment for Britain to reset the relationship. Yet not only do I lack confidence we've got our Africa policy right, I doubt we even have one. Our politicians and policymakers have simply shrugged Africa off, or worse, as if Africa were a matter for charity rather than diplomacy. And Toby, I want to apologize, subcontracted it to the virtual reality of the Department for International Development. The world of the lily pad and capacity building and a special language nobody understands, and new white Toyotas with nowhere to go. The only government department in history that starts with the money and ponders on how to spend it. And then he admonished the British government ministers for being interested in Africa for negative reasons only, and writes, and I quote, "Here are the right ones. Africa's GDP has been growing strongly for a long time, still above 4%. Even after the 2008 banking crisis, growth stayed buoyant. The continent's population is growing too. Africa is expanding fast as a market. It now has a bigger middle class than India. The rest of the world has noticed. And he ends his piece with, what Africa has now is promise, energy, and possibility. This is no time to turn away, unquote. And granted. Matthew Paris is writing in a fit of pique, and I can understand it. But I'd be surprised if there are many people in the room who disagree with the broad sentiment of what he expresses. However, what is important about that piece is that Matthew is writing in a vacuum that we've allowed to create because we have not filled it with the narrative of who we are and what we're capable of. And so we leave it to the FCO, State Department, and others to define who we are, and Francophonie, Ministry de Francophonie, to define who we are and what separates us, and how we need to live within the boundaries of what was decided at the Berlin Conference in 1885. Because we are incapable of deciding what Africa is about. And that is the challenge before us today. Because we actually have our own story about our past and a strong story about our future. And it's a coherent one of growth and opportunity. We recognize that the growth that we've seen since the late 1990s was occasioned by political stability, regulatory reform, improved governance, and better economic management. And that all of this was supported by external factors such as significantly improved commodity prices, inflows of FDI, technological advancement, and a global environment that was in the main more favorable to development since the ending of the Cold War. Now, however, what we need is a narrative that is driven by the needs that we ourselves define and commit to, by a set of measures we institute to improve the quality of life for all Africans, and by which the standing of our democracies will be judged. A significant part of this African narrative must draw attention to the unprecedented opportunities available to our continent. Let me share some of them with you, and I do so in no particular order. Firstly, addressing the infrastructure deficit, which includes cross-border infrastructure developments in power, rail, road networks, air and maritime transport, all of which would unlock interconnectivity of trade and communications. I'm aware that this is one of the top priorities of the NIPAD heads of state even now. But my pleading, and it's a very strong pleading, is that we move beyond the biannual communiques of intent that our heads of state deliver to the actual grind of projects that are designed, planned, priced, and proceeded. I must say, Peter, I'm very impressed with the fact that here at Saïd, you've committed time, energy, emotion to understanding water. It's so fundamentally important. The fact that we can look at water and still fail to harvest it and bring it to people and improve on the quality of life of people through water remains a shame, and so it's those kinds of gaps that we must fill, and we must do them in a way that recognizes what the importance of all of this is. The second, of course, and it's linked, is that we must expand this large, underdeveloped agricultural sector. It requires regulatory reform, infrastructure development in roads, water, and power, legislative reform in land use to enable inclusive agricultural development that benefits Africans, skills development to advance productivity and market development, to maximize the use potential that the land of Africa offers the world. You can look at this, or you can fly over Africa during the day and see that our agriculture is within walking distance of the village. It's, again, one of those issues that ought to be like shooting fish in a barrel. All that we must do is understand how to unlock this enormous potential. The third is that of economic integration. The commitment is made even in Vision 2063. But we must understand that the idea of an African economy that can maintain 54 separate economies, each with its own regulations and bureaucracies, is really not viable. So the hard political challenge is one of leadership and being able to persuade each other that in spite of the long, hard struggles for sovereignty, we will be able to celebrate our statehood unequivocally when the livelihoods of our people have improved significantly. Not when we've got the marching bands and the anthem and the many, many very large denomination banknotes with the face of the president, but when the quality of life of our people improves significantly. And we'll not attain this if we don't see ourselves as integrally African and recognize that our success will either be advanced or hindered by our relations with fellow Africans. I can't understand why it takes so much. I mean, Peter and I were talking this morning about how people in the US rally in support of a very strange candidate in the Republican primaries. But they feel American because they're going to feel great again. It doesn't take a hell of a lot to do that, but we as Africans still are at each other's throats about issues. The fourth issue I want to share is, of course, energy transitions. Over the past year, commitments to energy transformation has increased significantly. Amongst these, the new president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Adesina, has committed to universal access to energy for all Africans. This will mean taking installed capacity from 147 gigawatts to 700 by 2040. But if you look at the scale of the energy gaps at the moment, it's completely staggering. The USA uses 12,461 gigawatts per capita per year. Now, the world clearly cannot afford that level, but Ghana uses 342 gigawatts, and Liberia a mere 82 kilowatts, and Liberia a mere 82 kilowatt hours per capita. That's but 0.66% of what the US consumes. The framework for cross-border installation and properly regulated prices provides a great opportunity to unlock the combined economies across the continent. The fourth issue, very passionate part of who I am, is urban development. The rate of urbanization across the continent is advancing faster than on any other part of the globe. Whilst China now has more than 160 cities with populations of more than 1 million, the projected estimates for Africa are that by 2030 we'll have 80 cities of more than 1 million people. On a global scale, the advantages of urbanization are very apparent. City dwellers benefit from the agglomeration of services and opportunities. African policymakers need to engage with the reality that the poor tend to migrate to cities to seek opportunities to improve their lives. And if African cities are not able to accommodate them, they will seek opportunities elsewhere. While it's imperative that Africa retains its talented young people, this must be understood in the context of the current global movement of people. There's this thing that we have as post-liberation political leaders in Africa. We talk of rural development. TV cameras don't go to the rural areas. We talk of rural development because it lets us off the hook of dealing with the reality of what African cities are. And in the main, with notable exceptions like Addis more recently, in the main, our cities are little parcels of land where expats lived under the colonial period, and we higgledy-piggledy added bits to it without reconstructing the urban space and creating opportunities differently. And so it's imperative that African urban spaces be reorganized, properly planned for, serviced, and innovatively funded. The fifth issue is a dirty word: private sector development. While the difficult economic circumstances faced by many across the continent have created the most unbelievable wave of entrepreneurial energy, one of the biggest challenges is that too much of it is survivalist. And the competition in the sectors with low barriers to entry is both literally and figuratively cutthroat. I mean, the old road between Entebbe and Kampala tells a story. You can't move on the road. There's so much entrepreneurial activity. But so much of it is survivalist, and so we must celebrate the energy of people, but recognize that it exists because nothing else is available. The growing demand by the business sector for advisory support, access to affordable finance, transformation and market access means that systems of continuing education and skills development have to be prioritized. Appropriate measures to manage bureaucratic procedures and facilitate the ease of doing business must be put in place to support nascent businesses across the continent. The sixth, also obvious issue is harvesting the demographic dividend. By all accounts, the greatest asset we have as Africans is our large number of young people. Our population will total approximately 4 billion by the end of the century, from about 1 billion last year. This means more than a third of people on Earth will be African. Perhaps most exciting is that within 20 years, the number of sub-Saharan Africans of working age will exceed the rest of the world combined. This suggests that companies should increasingly look to Africa as a key source of labor when making decisions about expansion and new investments, provided we get the infrastructure right, we get the people right, and we get the systems in place. We must be clear that these changes won't happen automatically. A recent World Bank study published under the rubric Youth Unemployment in Africa, what to do when informal is normal, unquote, tells the entire story. And the report recognizes that 70 to 80% of young people eke out an existence in low productivity, informal farms or household enterprises. That argues that the twin imperatives of creating more wage and salary jobs must go hand in hand with improvements of productivity. My submission on this is that unless we retool the education system in its entirety, from preschool, school, university, and vocational training, all of this will remain a pipe dream. We'll gather 10, 20 years down the line, look at it again, reflect on it, bemoan the fact that we've wasted the opportunity. But it's not going to happen unless we get access to education right and the quality of education significantly improved. Now, I want to make no pretense about suggesting that this list of proposals is complete or that they'll find equal resonance across our 54 countries. I do know that they've all been repeatedly researched by academics and policymakers in various institutions and that they all still beg implementation. I remain of the view that they cannot be implemented autonomously. We must continue to have a focus on good accountable governance as a sine qua non for the development of our collective and separate economies. Governments must be trusted, they must be able to pass laws and make rules in the interests of their citizens, and they must be held accountable for their actions. We know it to be obvious that the private sector operates best when clear, predictable rules exist. As an example of this, President Mugabe recently made a public admission that diamonds worth 15 billion US dollars, not Zim dollars, US dollars, may have been stolen by foreign mining firms operating in Zimbabwe. While this is a distressing statement, one has to ask what rules were put in place ex ante for mining firms, both local and foreign, as good governance would dictate that those rules be in place. But good governance is also about ensuring the absence of corruption and the provision of good quality services and participation of the people. Good governance can only be exercised by institutions that are strong and unimpeachable. We are fortunate to have 3 collaborating Pan-African institutions in the African Development Bank, the African Union, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, We recognize, however, that the influence of these institutions is limited. They need interaction with strong domestic governments who feel a sense of accountability, as well as a set of re-engineered regional economic communities. Now, I want to just say, and it's not just because I'm the praise poet, but I want to say that I left the dinner last night, Angwani, very impressed and my spirits lifted by many of the students I met last night. I feel that there's hope for Africa, provided people return and recognize that there's a heck of a lot of work to be done. We can change and must change the quality of leadership in business and governments. And that, I think, is a big moment that presents itself to your generation now. And then there's the fuel for economic development finance. Africa's demands will always be substantially greater than supply of this commodity. Available resources will therefore have to be stretched, leveraged and efficiently utilized. The scale of what we have to do requires that we need access to financial flows, development resources and private sector funds, all blended together to produce the desired and considered outcomes. And finally, there's the data that we need to measure progress and efficacy. Too often we operate on instinct, repeating mistakes or failed methods. We need a data revolution to measure and record the progress that we make and to use for future planning. A tough measure that has been set out for us in those words, quote, an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. The basic premise remains that no other parties are as committed to the development of Africa as we are. It was the Buffalo Soldier Bob Marley who sang, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but yourselves can free our minds." This, I believe, is the correct, or is the core of our necessary narrative. We've got so much going for us. Most importantly, we've got smart, young, determined leaders, many of whom are in this room today. We can make a difference, and we look to your leadership to do much better than what we did. Thank you very much. It's okay, Peter. Come over.
Trevor's pouring some water. He's happy to take a few questions. So if you might keep your questions short, perhaps introduce yourself, and who'd like to begin?
Any questions?
I'm sure there are questions. Yes.
I was slightly surprised when you said that the idea of an Africa that would sort of grow without integration, I found it a little surprising. Probably partly because a lot of young Africans do not sort of share that same vision. So I guess the question is it possible to have such an integrated vision when you have so many different countries?
You know, if you look back on decisions, and this is why it's useful to record decisions. The Abuja Treaty put in place the idea of an African common market by 2025, and this was in the 80s. And it recognized that you're not going to have a single path from, it wasn't 54 countries then, to the African common market. And so it put in place building blocks, regional economic communities. And some of them functioned reasonably well. ECOWAS, for instance, is functioning much better. The East African community, sometimes there are a few issues between leaders, but in the main, it has made very substantial progress. You can see the integratedness of infrastructure. You can see the macroeconomic convergence towards a rational ordering of even the idea of a single East African currency. Those things are there. But it's uneven across the continent. And so in our region, South Africa is a member of SADC. There are other countries that are members of COMESA, the Common Market for East and Southern Africa. The East African community is absorbed between the two. But COMESA is a very large body that starts with Swaziland in the south and runs all the way to Egypt. I don't know how you administer something quite as large. But earlier this year, in fact, the leaders signed the agreement called the Tripartite Agreement that would, in fact, create the basis for a common market. But like other communiques, the key issue is how it will be implemented, measured, and reported on. It's the only way forward. I think if we have that and we have a strong ECOWAS and you have Central Africa operating much better. Also, you can look at IGAD in the Horn, where Ethiopia is actually doing an incredible amount of work, but so much of the Horn of Africa is still affected by war. Somalia and Eritrea would be two of the countries that are exceedingly difficult to get peace in that region. But we shouldn't wait until the perfect moment. I think the key issue is to build these regional economic communities and produce out of them the demonstration effect of what is possible in integration. Thanks. Somebody's got to assign who speaks.
Over there. Yeah, please.
Hi, Trevor. I'm an executive MBA student here at Oxford. You make mention of the fact that education is...
Is MBA your name or surname?
Marco.
Okay.
My name's Marco. You make mention of the fact that education is a massive platform for Africa as a whole. Being South African and understanding that, you know, in the apartheid regime, 17 Rand was spent on every white child's education when only 1 Rand was spent on an African child's education. In your mind, what is the 1 or 2 most important things that we need to do to fix something that's such a massive problem in our country?
Okay, let me tell 2 little anecdotes, and Peter will ensure that I keep them short. The one is a school, and I asked Tangwani if she went there. It's called Mbilwi. It's in the region where she comes from, close to Thohoyandou. Mbilwi has had 100% grade 12 pass rate for almost 20 years now. And I don't think they've dropped below 75% of school leavers who can enter university. It's not a private school. It's not sort of Bishop's or St. John's or Rodin. It's not any of those kinds of schools. It's a community school driven by deep passion, where students stay after school and parents come in to supervise projects and so on. And the parents are like parents everywhere else. The motivation is different. I was constituency MP for Mitchell's Plain in the Western Cape. I still work there. The contest to improve on education is so phenomenally great. And we're seeing significant improvements in high school. The 100% pass mark has been attained. The key issue now is to work through high schools, primary schools, and also get the ECD system right. Because the great division in kids' lives starts before they actually get to school. It's where cognitive development is actually separated. And this requires a passion that frequently teachers on their own don't have. I argue because, you know, I can be maverick and difficult about issues. that it's not so much a big systems issues. It's not about outcomes-based education. There are three interfaces at work, fundamentally important in education. The first is the teacher in the class. The second is the principal with the staff. And the third is the school and the community. If you can fix those interfaces, as we see with Mbilwe and a number of other successful schools in poverty-stricken areas, you can make a huge difference. And I was reading last week a maths teacher at Mbilwe saying, I set out from grade 8 with one task, and that is to demonstrate how easy mathematics is. And that's why we get the quality of maths passes that we do. So it's possible. It's possible. You don't need to look elsewhere. I think that what we need to do is package those experiences and share them with the rest.
I think we'll take 2 more questions, if we could. Maybe this woman over here.
Hi, Trevor. My name is Yolandi Mirza, and I'm just here out of personal interest, being a fellow African. I'm quite worried about, while Africa is still trying to get there and develop, and we have so many resources, but it's not yet there. I'm worried about ownership. How do we keep the world a little bit, not buying up the whole of Africa, if you like, and, keep ownership and just realize how important it is, because it feels like we are signing deals which have such a long duration that we won't be able to get ownership back one day when we wake up.
I can mention 2 examples, and sometimes bad decisions get the backs up of people. And the first of these was in Madagascar, when the president signed a deal with one of the Asian countries to be kind of its food basket, and vast, vast tracts of land were given to this Asian country to produce food. And it caused a revolution in the country. And hence the point I'm making about agriculture is, if the ideas are owned and we invest adequately in all of what is necessary for the infrastructure to support the agricultural system, then we can create African owners and we can have inclusive economies. Not because we talk about it, but because we demonstrate what is possible. If you want to shift from this, the realm of subsistence farming to larger scale agriculture, and again, you can look at some countries where they're much better at horticulture, and I'll include Kenya and Ethiopia in that list. It's possible because the investments are adequate. And that's what we've got to do to drive the change. I mean, a lot of vegetables you get here in the UK, salads, for instance, grown, prepared, packaged, priced, gets onto the flight out of Nairobi at night. It's in Marks and Spencer and Waitrose the following morning. If we can get that right with a number of different sectors, then I think you can measure improvements in the quality of life. The reason I actually included the story of the Zimbabwean diamonds is because the outcry in Zimbabwe now is, but why did the government do these deals that they had no control over? What are the ex-ante rules? And so, the way I approach this is not to just look to the future. And there've been countries. I mean, in Botswana, the president was not happy with 2 things that Chinese companies had signed on for. The one was the construction of a power station. The other was the airport at Gaborone. And President Khama basically came along and said, this is not what the Botswana are used to. Thank you very much. Off you go. And if we can do those kinds of things, and we can ensure that countries contract in a way where contracts can be checked and verified, and the financial flows can be clarified, we're actually going to do a hell of a lot better. But it does mean that we need good government and active civil society interacting in every country across the continent.
One more question, then we'll take a quick break and we'll go on to the next How about this gentleman here, second one in, right near you. Thank you.
Hi, Trevor. My name is Ludovic Claude. I'm from Cameroon, currently working for Citibank. My question would be, how do you promote social and environment standards in and effective governments in post-conflict African countries such as Rwanda or Sierra Leone, while developing private sectors in those countries?
You know, Rwanda is probably the best example that we have of a country that has risen from a post-conflict situation. Because the attribute that the country has is that people are always reminded through active work and sharing experiences never to go back to that dark place again. So once a month, Rwandese people gather to clean up the place. If I look at waste recycling in Rwanda, it probably is at the levels of Scandinavian countries. Nobody litters. People take a very serious view of themselves in society because nothing is allowed to be forgotten. And I want to distinguish that from my own country. You see, we came from a dark place. A dark place is reflected in our constitution. The preamble starts with, we remember the injustices of the past, and then makes assumptions about how we get there. But we've, in the 20 years since we've adopted the Constitution, hoped that you will deliver this by autopilot. You don't. And the vast difference, I think, in the final analysis is not how good the quality of your legislation is, but how people internalize their responsibilities in society. And I say, if you ask me about Africa, I will go back and use the Rwandese experience every time, because it is truly a phenomenal experience of what is possible given the scale of trauma that that country lived through in the genocide of 1994. So it's possible. We must believe that it's possible and use what we see around us to good effect everywhere. Thank you.